All right. Hello, everyone who's come out here today in Charlotte. We are about to get started here today with our Tech Talk panel. Also want to say welcome to everyone who's joined us remotely as well. We really appreciate everyone coming together to have a really just great open talk about some of the things that are relevant in the industry. Today, in particular, the conversation is going to focus on evidence-driven design. And so we have some great panelists that will allow to introduce themselves here shortly. I did want to just share a quick story before we got going, because I thought it actually mapped really well to the topic that we have today and would serve as a good intro. I was in the office last week here at Method, and a couple of our product resources were here working with different clients on different challenges, catching up together, just asking each other what they were doing. And as the conversation that I was eavesdropping on continued, the question really became is like, what are you doing? And they were saying, our teams that we're working with at our clients are having a real hard time committing to making decisions, and part of my role is just giving them the confidence that they need to be able to say, yeah, let's go ahead and do this. Like, we have enough evidence to be able to move forward. And I thought, like, what a fortuitous, kind of lead into the conversation today to be overhearing two consultants in the product realm who are working with two different clients, both clients struggling with just getting to a place of feeling like, hey, we know what we need to do. And I think the zone they landed in was like, hey, if you're 60 to 80% confident with something, let's just go do it. Let's figure it out. Let's have a bias for action, which I think is the new better term than maybe fail fast of years of before, which I think struck fear in too many rooms around the world. And so I thought that would be a good introduction for us just today to talk about, why do we need evidence? What do we need evidence? What is the right amount of evidence to be able to make the right decisions within design and the products and experiences that we develop? But you didn't come here to hear me. You came to hear our great panel. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Just as a format, we'll do some introductions. I'm going to lead people through some questions today. But because we have such a great audience here and online as well, I'll try and leave about 10 minutes at the end to just grab some questions. And that way you can hear directly from the panelists on the things that matter most to you. So without any further ado, I'm going to start on the far side here. And Rob, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Maybe just give a little bit about your background, and in particular, what about that background that led you to a place of, evidence-driven design opinions?
Yeah, so Rob Berini, most of my career has been in the consulting and agency space, was with IBM for over a decade, and with Deloitte on the Deloitte Digital side for about 7.5, 8 years. Most recently, I was with UBS, leading their experience design and analytics team, or what became the experience design and analytics team, as we began to more tightly integrate evidence and different sources of evidence into our process, right? So more tightly weave in the research that we were doing, more tightly weave in the analytics that we were doing to really drive confident decisions, use the word confidence. And that's really the way we think about it as well. How do we give product owners and our other stakeholders confidence in the decisions that we're collectively making and the recommendations that we're making? So that's what kind of led me to this space.
That's great. Thanks. Lauren, go ahead.
Making sure, yes, this is on. Hi, everyone. Great to see all of you here. And I just want to say thank you so much for having us here on the panel and for Method to host us tonight. I think that these events are incredible. I always leave inspired. So I'm a mix of humbled and freaked out that I'm responsible partly for that for you guys tonight. So hope it goes well. But I have been in the Charlotte area since I was 4, started out my career at Red Ventures. After that, went to Ally Bank, then One Main Financial, and I'm currently with Vanguard. So lots of time in the financial services space. And I think for me, I've always been on the product side of things. And evidence-based design is so instrumental to gaining stakeholder buy-in and being on the product side. And now I lead product strategy for Vanguard, being in the room with the business more times than you might care to be. You need evidence to back you up. And so working with teams that have that as a primary focus is what's brought me to this place today.
Yeah, and I know Rob in particular is really interested in that topic of who are we evidence to and who has decision-making authority, and we'll get into that a little bit later, which is I think where we'll have some fun. But before we do, John, give us a little bit of your background as well too.
All right. Thank you for having me, everybody, and Mike and Method. John Ochenas, originally a industrial designer, about 25 years ago, pivoted into digital. Been fortunate enough to work in media, internet, retail, telecom, e-commerce, industrial, and most recently finance. Currently a free agent, considering opportunities and planning summer travel. So that's where I'm at. I guess I'd say my passion is making AI apologize to me.
All right. Well, we'll see if there's evidence that we can give you about where you should travel today. Well, great. Well, let's go ahead and jump into our topic. I'm really excited to unpack it a little bit with each of you. So where I really wanted to start was, why are we providing evidence? What are we ultimately trying to accomplish? And so maybe just starting with your own perspectives and opinions around, how do you really look at the highest order of organizational objectives and then start to cascade down the metrics that you're going to look at, the ways that you're going to evidence the decisions that you're going to make to be able to achieve those top line objectives? Lauren, since I started, with Rob before, you mind if I put you on the spot and just kind of get your perspective on tying together high level organizational objectives and then the things you're trying to do on a day-to-day within a product realm?
Yeah, for sure. And it's an interesting construct, and I've tried to explain this at all levels of an organization before, because it's especially the folks who are boots on the ground doing the work in the weeds every day that want to know, well, gee, how is what we're doing helping, the organization at large to achieve these broader strategic initiatives? Then comes the question, once they understand those initiatives, well, why are those the initiatives that are important? And so I feel like having a really great communication throughout the ecosystem and through all levels of leadership is really, really critical, so that folks understand their why, and that you can make those connections. So lately I've been challenging hey, we need to understand the broader strategic initiatives and make sure that what we're doing ladders up. And challenging that a bit. So sometimes you'll have evidence that maybe doesn't align, but should it? And so when you can push that envelope a little, and bring that evidence to bear and work its way up through the levels of leadership that it needs to actually influence some of those broader strategic initiatives, I think that that's what can be the most rewarding.
Yeah, I love how you said the why, right? And it is really easy for, employees who are involved in the day-to-day execution of a very specific thing to suddenly just be so separated from that. And so always creating that connectivity is obviously key. John, why don't you wax a little bit on your perspective here? Where have you seen challenges or opportunities in creating that connectivity between high level objectives and what teams are working on, and how does that influence the way that you think about creating evidence to support decisions along the way?
Yeah, thank you. So I believe design at heart is a very intentional activity, right? We are being intentional, and the concept of evidence in large or evidence-driven design really ratchets that up. It's both a new set of tools to bring to the problems we solve, but also a new mandate about how we solve and present them. And that really gets to the heart of what interests me. You say, how do we bring this and deploy it? I'd echo totally what you said, Lauren. Depending on your context, you may not be able to tie individual decisions at the team level to outcomes, and that becomes a tricky thing to navigate. So yes, that's kind of where I'm at with it. The key thing I think then is your goal, if nothing else, is to be able to communicate business strategy downwards in ways, even if you can't show the causal connection.
Yeah, I think we'll spend a lot of time talking today about communication, right? And there's this necessity to communicate upwards, to communicate downwards, to communicate across teams and stakeholders, to really just demonstrate why you're working on what you're seeing in the market, why you're making the decisions that you're making, and then ultimately, how are things performing out there, right? Anything you want to add to that, Rob?
Well, just to pick up on one of the things Jonathan said, and then Lauren. So on this aspect of what is design, design is problem solving, right? And we're best when we're brought in first in that problem space and helping to explore the problem space and define the problem space. And it's impossible to understand the problem space if you don't understand what the objectives are, right? And different firms are at different levels of maturity of adoption of OKRs or maybe still use balanced scorecards, or maybe have the metrics or don't have the metrics to support these kinds of things. So various levels of, are we really measuring outcomes? Are we measuring output? Are we measuring activity? But when done well, that cascading that Lauren talked about in terms of, oh, I understand why I'm working on this and how it ladders up to the top level objectives of usually just revenue, cost, risk. If I can break that down, and I did, when I was with IBM, did a lot of work around value driver trees of how do we break that down into smaller and smaller metrics of the thing that we're actually impacting. So when the designer understands the thing that their design is impacting, and when they can collaborate with the product owner in solving that problem, especially if it's framed in a journey, and I understand I'm solving this part of the journey, this metric, and that then trees up to this OKR, then that's very powerful, and it provides a mechanism for conversation and a mechanism for problem solving that is what design is about. Design's not art, right? Design is problem solving. And so like having that basis and conversation is critical.
A lot of goodness there. And I love the anchoring back in the journey in a way that's traceable and connected for individuals who are, maybe beneath that level. A lot of times we do see folks get so isolated in a silo that they almost lose track of a customer experience or the whole entirety of what they're trying to solve for, and it becomes easy to become almost obsessed and overly analytical with that particular thing without really remembering why are we doing this in the first place, right? Staying in this topic of connectivity there for just a moment, an area that's fascinated me particularly of late is how well or maybe poorly organizations are doing the connectivity between what I would call traditional business objectives, things like productivity or efficiency, and then the more human side of objectives. And so would love to hear a little bit from you all on where have you seen that be a challenge? Where have you seen an opportunity? What kind of strategies have you kind of done to create connectivity between the two, so that it's not as if there's an efficiency objective and then there's a human-centered objective, and a lot easier to call it evidence the efficiency objective at the end of the day than the human one, and them not being a challenge. So maybe John, start with you this time, and then we'll kind of wind our way down.
Yeah. So you got me thinking right there about the idea of like an evidence anchor, right? How do we consider a human dynamic alongside the business objectives, right? And so you might say, it's really important that we only have single sign-on, right? There's only one sign-on, or it's only really important that we only put this information in one time and we recall it for the customer anytime we need it. And so I think in terms of being able to take the human experience, building in those evidence anchors early to make sure you satisfy them. You're not going to be able to solve everything, but many of my comments tonight are going to focus around, again, intentionality and doing it upstream, not in the heat of the moment. So pick those things, determine your guardrails, build in evidence anchors to validate them along the way, and that will find you, I think, a reasonable intersection of business objectives and customer strategy.
Yeah, I really like that. Rob, do you want to continue the conversation here?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, talk a little bit around the ideal here, because too often we're measuring activity or output because that's what we can measure, right? Instead of really outcomes. However, when done well and when connected across agile ways of working, which most organizations are following now, not all, but most in some capacity, right? Then the tools of design, what done well, actually connect very tightly to that connectivity between the user story and the business objective, the OKR, right? As a persona, I want feature so that I can achieve jobs to be done, right? And then if you connect that feature, then that will result in client outcome, which will result in business outcome. And if you construct that well, if you can create that connectivity from top level of the organization, and if you're, many organizations are kind of set up in these cascading streams or pods or crews or, whatever the language is at different organizations. If that's done well, then you have very clear alignment between, I know why I'm doing this user story, not just like what my job is, but like why I'm doing this particular feature for this user story. And you can connect all those artifacts of traditional design. You can understand why they're there, like how they contribute to really exploring and articulating and giving confidence, again, that we're building the right thing because we've framed it across to that client outcome and then the business outcome.
Very well stated. I think we should just get the soundbite of your breakdown there and make it the header for the event today. I think there's a whole world we could unpack within that very simple sounding, but important to get right and sometimes challenging layout that you just presented there. Lauren, bring us home. Talk a little bit about your experience in this area and what you've seen work, or maybe some of the challenges that arise in trying to balance business and human objectives.
Yeah, I love your talk track around the evidence anchors, and then also tying together and really making sure whenever possible that you can marry together those client outcomes with the business outcomes, because then everyone feels really great. I think the one thing that we haven't talked about that's on my mind is the validation of some of that. So you can look at all the data that you want and you can come up with a hypothesis, and then you go to test it out and you say, oh, this actually isn't going to achieve what we expected. And making sure that in those moments you have the necessary tools and discipline to inflect and say, okay, maybe we should route somewhere else or stop something altogether. And it's tough when you are focused on, business over human or human over business, because then, that's where I think a lot of hesitancy can come into play, because you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings or be wrong about something. And so I think that validation piece is key.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think we can kind of go into some of that kind of latter half of what you're bringing up and have a whole conversation here in a moment around, how to evidence along the way when you are doing research and gaining confidence in ideas. We'll stay high level for just one more moment, and let's drill into the human side of measures. I think there was a CSAT, type of revolution that happened, and then kind of questions around, whether that was an effective measure or not. An introduction of a handful of other kind of top line measures, and now we're seeing some blended scoring. Would love just an open conversation amongst the four of us around what have you seen, what has worked well, what are the challenge points with individual pros and cons, call it of different measures at the top of the house. So maybe we just start, Rob, with you, and just kind of walk through what trends have you seen over your career? What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the bright spots in trying to come up with a human measure of what you're trying to achieve at that very top line?
Yeah, I mean, satisfaction is, as much as it's gone through various iterations, and should we use NPS and should we use other mechanisms, to me is still the gold standard, in that it is the leading indicator, right? So in UX, we're often trying to measure leading indicators, not lagging indicators. The lagging indicators are revenue or the cost reduction or whatever it may be. So we're just trying to get some hint that this thing will affect the business outcome that we're looking to affect. So I still think that some form of satisfaction, and we've used, typical kind of 10-point scales, the NPS scores, et cetera. I don't think that's changing much. The other ones that are obviously critical are understanding what are those success rates, what are the conversion rates, really looking at those funnels, understanding, and I mentioned this earlier, aligning those metrics across the journey, and then being able to level up those journeys, right? To understand from what I have at the user flow level through to what I have at, more of a product journey level, to a user journey, to a lifetime journey. How am I treeing up those metrics as well to understand where am I having an impact on their ability to effectively achieve this goal? So I think at the very top level, it gets to satisfaction and ease and conversion rate or success rate. Below that, it breaks down into things like, error rates and time on task and et cetera, right? But to me, it's still, in my mind, in that universe of satisfaction is still the gold standard in terms of what we're measuring to understand, are we doing the right things in terms of UX?
Yeah, just open, anyone have a response, any other favorites, any other strong opinions on some of the more common measures at the kind of top of house in terms of, figuring out how you're achieving, the customer experience within an organization?
I'm going to say another killer soundbite, Rob. I need to write this down. This is great. So I think I'll echo that. Not a lot has changed in that space. I think CSAT is something that everyone looks towards, and directionally it can give you a lot. It can give you a lot of information. I would say the only thing to build off that really is as you're looking through the journey analytics and you're deciding what it is that you're going to do, it's important to then say, well, what aren't you going to do, and make sure that everyone across the organization is aligned with that. I think that a lot of times folks can get into a space where they think that everything can be done, and maybe it's a not now, but just later. And sometimes you have to really align on, well, you know, because of the data that we're seeing, this is something that we're going to have to deprioritize. Yeah, the analytics, I think that, yeah, CSAT, ease was always my favorite. Engagement's important too. When you look at things and try to make sure that folks are going to be stickier customers along the way.
Yeah, and just quickly, I mean, the thing that's important about both SAT and ease is they are things that you can measure early on in the testing process, in the user testing process, right? You can start to get some hint at what it might be at the end by doing some early stage testing there, which is the other reason that it tends to be so sticky in terms of a metric, is that we have ways to kind of get at some sense of, are we on the right direction towards that metric?
Makes sense.
I would agree with both of you, and I'll just go ahead and round it out. I think absolutely satisfaction, critical. Ease of use, critical. Usefulness rounds out the triple crown, right? Of useful, usable, and satisfying. So I think you have to look at all those things. I think, again, you need to think about what you're doing before you need to do it, because my colleague Brett in the audience, I've run into a situation where we wanted to change a metric that served a good purpose and was scientifically valid, but it was a big problem getting it across the finish line when we were changing our minds. So I think you got to come up. Do you use SUS or UX or UX Lite? I don't really care. Brevity is kind of a key differentiator there, but don't try to change midstream. Work with your partners in your organization beforehand.
Feel free to build, but I think one thing I really liked about what you said there, John, was working your way backwards, right? And I think that's a big key. I'd love for you all to talk a little bit about kind of your perspectives on, one, how do you work your way backwards from, you know, what types of measures, but also what types of decisions and what types of evidence are going to influence the decisions, and are people willing to have that conversation up front within an organization to be able to then really land, okay, it's worthwhile to do this research. We're going to evidence it. And then when we get to the decision point, we should have a clear path based on what the results say. So I'll kind of just seed that and let you jump in and kind of weigh in on what your thoughts are there.
Well, I'm forgetting the name of the business school. Somebody might be able to, Roger Martin, who is also a famous kind of design thinker as well, has a great way of distilling this of just kind of what must be true, right? So once we lay out a strategy or a product vision, articulating very early on what must be true in order for this to be successful, and then backcasting from that, right? We're so used to forecasting, we're so used to building business cases that are really sit in a vacuum and are meant to kind of justify some investment, but really don't ever get checked. They're not meant to be a mechanism to measure the success of something. But if you really think about what must be true for this to be successful in 3 years or 2 years or 5 months or whatever it is, and then start to articulate what are the things that we're already confident in, that we already know, and what are the things that we don't know, and how would we get confidence in those, right? And that's where the mechanisms of research, but it's not just UX, the team or the design team that's doing this, obviously, but they are a critical component to getting confidence that the research questions that we have, and being very deliberate around articulating those research questions towards that what's must be true, can frame the type of work that we're doing over the next 6 months or a year.
One thing I'll throw in, excuse me. So starting at Red Ventures, you know, when it was a true startup, you know, we're 100 people or so in a strip mall next to a daycare down in Valentine. We had a lot of autonomy, and there were times there when we didn't have all the evidence, or we didn't have it in time, and we just needed to show someone that something was going to work if we truly believed it. And so there was a really, you know, bias to action, but also bias to experimentation. And I think that that's something that gets lost a lot the larger the organization, because they don't even want you to experiment without the right evidence. And so what I have tried to do in my roles at larger organizations is to find pockets where experimentation is possible. So maybe you only have a few of the metrics that folks would consider, okay, we're confident to make this decision. But you can get the rest of the way there through some small experiment or some small prototype. And I think that that's something that has really, really been useful to me at these larger organizations. I can think of an example recently where there was a 2-year-old project that everyone had ignored. They said, no, we're not going to do it. And the idea came up again. And of course I got hey, we tried that 5 years ago. We tried it 2 years ago. It's never going to be a thing. So, you take the rest of the day off. And so I said, well, let's see what we can do to maybe make a prototype. And so in our, free time, we went off and we built something really small, scrappy, used Figma and brought it and tested it with some folks, just grassroots. And we got the additional data that we needed through that. And it wasn't formal. And it certainly wasn't what anyone was used to. But I think that it helped get us over the finish line. And so the more that you can, bring in those kind of experimental moments, I think the better for everyone.
I think I could offer builds on both of them. I really like it. This idea of, show, don't tell is a great way to start to get buy-in, to allow you to collect the evidence that you needed to even build the thing that you just showed, which gets really weirdly circular. But that's a great one. And then this idea of what must be true starts to get you to a decision tree, which can map out these discrete moments in time. And then you can examine those moments and you can look at techniques like the abstraction laddering. We talked about how and why, up and down. Why is this decision important? And then you can bring out the right toolkit to address it. But I don't think there's universality. And I think those kind of conversations almost always precede a successful outcome.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, Lauren, is this experimentation or the prototype. This concept of MVP has kind of taken on a life that it was not its original intention.
It's MV perfect now.
Yeah, exactly, right.
MV done.
And if you think about mapping it to the kind of typical Venn circles of feasibility, desirability, viability, it maps very cleanly to minimum is minimum feasible. Product is what's desirable. How do we prove that people want it? And viable is obviously viable, right? So if we think about it in that term, and then we can create hypotheses around those specific categories of what do we need to learn to get comfortable, not just actually around the desirability part, but around the minimum part and around the viable part, and build hypotheses in conjunction with the design team. Again, it's not just the responsibility of the design team, it's the product team, it's the business teams, and it's others. To get comfortable that we are in fact have something that's viable and also desirable and feasible.
It's funny you brought up the MVP. I was chatting with one of our audience members just before coming up on stage around the graveyard of MVPs that are out there in the corporate world, where there's excitement, there's funding, there's projectization, there's a release, and then it's no longer a product. It's done. It's just something that needs to perform as was forecasted, as opposed to realizing that was the MVP and now is the real learning, improving time, right? And the refinement. And the number of times we see organizations release something that was intended to be an MVP, and then the next shiny thing has appeared on the prioritization, the teams pivot, they disperse, and whatnot. There's this graveyard of MVPs out there in the world, and there has been a little bit of failure of understanding between funding cycles and agile processes, right? Yeah. So, well, I think Lauren introduced us to what I think will be a fun topic to dive into, which is who are we evidencing to, and why, and when should we have to present evidence versus when is it a decision of our own and different roles across organizations to be able to move something forward. So I'd love to kind of tease that kind of charged topic out there and just kind of say, in the different roles that you've had, and I like, Lauren, you brought up scrappy startup, what's just enough evidence, bias for action versus corporate. So I welcome kind of perspectives from anyone on different types of companies that you've worked for, and who are we evidencing to? Why are we evidencing to them? And then in those scenarios, what evidence, are you having to bring? So, let's just kind of chat about that for a minute and just go in different directions. I think it's a fun one.
I'll start. So I've been in several organizations, all different flavors of, who do you have to evidence to and why? And then I think a lot of that is, it's all relationship building at the end of the day, and, building some of that political currency. And it sounds silly to say that, because you would think, well, if I just have the right evidence, then they should be convinced. Like, why must I do the proper song and dance and bring it all together in the perfect package to actually get them to do something? Or why does something have to fail first for them to realize that what you were saying is actually correct? And so there's definitely some frustration points in there along the way. And even when regimes change and you have a different sentimentality that you have to deal with, I think a lot of that comes to bear as well. So it's not just about the evidence. It is about the people involved. And I would also point out that I'm excited for AI and what a lot of the artificial intelligence is going to be bringing to this game, because I think that will can, for the better, maybe the worst too, change some of those conversations. AI is a buzzword now. Folks want to hear it. If they hear that AI was involved in any part of your evidence gathering, they think it's better than if it wasn't. And I think the more that you can bring in some of these novel things to connect why what you're evidencing is important, and connect it to some of those broader initiatives like we talked about before, and find those commonalities, I think that that's going to be game changing for the industry.
If I could just build on that really quick, one of the first things, if I'm thinking about an audience, an individual, a context where I have to present evidence, I'm thinking about the incentives of the audience. And that's going to be one of the leading indicators of what you present and how you present it. Is it factual? Is it emotional? That is, the relationship part of it. You've got to understand your partners and how they work.
Yeah, I would say in the trenches, the person that you most need to help gain that confidence and that is your recipient of the evidence is the product owner, right, or product manager that you're working with as a designer. Absent that, in terms of stakeholders, it's like it could be anybody. Like you never know actually where the questions are going to come from, right? So you got to be prepared to answer any question, any objection, and you actually have to invite that. I think is important in the design profession, to invite scrutiny and be prepared for it. So those are like the first two categories that are a little bit kind of outside the design. I think obviously one of the things that maybe we don't pay enough attention to as a profession is you also have to evidence to your design leader, right, why you've made a decision, what's the justification, and you have to evidence to yourself. And I think too often, especially in a corporate environment, we get kind of caught up in the just doing the work and trying to get something out and just responding to the ask. And how do you really kind of take a step back and say, how do I justify this decision that I've made? And what evidence do I have? And from that perspective, I can't remember if we get into this question, but maybe I'll take a little bit of a detour into what is evidence? Because you clearly kind of an experiment or A/B testing, a proper kind of constructed thing is a source of evidence. It is typically very strong evidence if done well, and if interpreted well, which is another story, but but if constructed well and if interpreted well is very strong evidence. Quantitative evidence is also very strong at the right kind of moment and is very convincing usually to stakeholders. Obviously, kind of the qualitative work that we do and is research to support things sometimes gets lost. And I think we need to do a better job of communicating the value of that evidence and what are we learning and what does it mean to have a significant finding there, which isn't statistically significant, but is you've reached a saturation point or other kind of measures of why you do qualitative. And then the final source of evidence that I think gets lost in the profession and a lot of people shy away from in design is kind of the lexicon of design. Like we're standing on hundreds of years of design theory and other things, not just design theory, but design principles, human factors, psychology, behavioral economics, et cetera, et cetera. And I actually think, Jonathan's background in industrial design, they do a better job of kind of standing on the discipline of design than maybe sometimes UX designers do, which is often rooted in graphic design, which is about which version of this do you like, client, right? Right. So, but industrial designers like Adita Rams is like more kind of forward, or Johnny Ives. I am critical to the design process, and I actually think we should embrace, not to be obnoxious, right? But you need to embrace using the lexicon of design and using that as part of your evidence, the laws of UX, Gestalt principle, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, at the right moment, not to be, again, obnoxious, kind of spewing out stuff, but to say, well, this is actually part of the evidence as well, right? And I actually find that product owners find that helpful. Oh, I'd never heard of that. And consultancies and agencies sometimes use it. Definitely other professions use it. The data science professions uses unfamiliar language all the time. So why don't we as designers embrace the unfamiliar language that we've been introduced to and use that to our effect to also deliver evidence?
I really like that, and would just like to build quickly. One of my first titles was Human Factors Engineer, which spoke to the rigor behind what we did. And it was a different end of the spectrum between art and science that we exist on wherever we work. There's something to be said for getting back to that and absolutely being in command of your material, right? When you are required to present, you better know it and you better be able to present it accurately. It's part of the job description now.
One more thing I'll say on the note of who are we evidencing to, my mind automatically jumps to, the end point of leadership, the business, legal, risk, compliance, who is it that we have to convince? But I think one of the most important parties that we're evidencing to is technology and your software engineering partners, because at the end of the day, they're going to be your strongest proponent or your biggest hurdle when it comes to convincing everybody else. And if they can be in lockstep and really be passionate about the evidence that you're bringing and the outcomes that you want to achieve, then it can make it that much easier to do battle later on in the various levels of leadership that you need to convince.
Do battle, very ominous, but real, right?
Every day.
I want to stay here. I think this is just such a fun topic. So I'm going to push you all to kind of try and give me some examples, and the audience some examples of, I love the what is evidence. And maybe we take, qual, right? Like when you're doing research with people and you're just trying to capture what needs are, what does constitute evidence? And then maybe to the point, how do you tell the story of what you heard and what you witnessed in that process of having interviews with folks to be able to demonstrate that? I think we've all been in the hippo or, hey, go back and count how many times that word was actually used kind of scenario. And so I'm just kind of curious in your own words, whether it's that example or another that you have, what actually is evidence to you as an individual, as you put it, Rob? And then I love this kind of like, are you leaning into the emotional storytelling element, and how do you effectively tell that story where not only are you maybe not coming across too academic, but you're kind of communicating in ways people can digest. So would love any examples that you all have around your own personal definitions and then the ways that you've told stories to evidence it to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important in conducting and delivering qualitative work, as you mentioned. And too often that's misunderstood. Why did you only talk to 5 people or whatever, right? Because often, so again, sometimes you're looking for the saturation point of, okay, I'm hearing the same thing over and over again. So that's evidence, right? It's not evidence in a statistical fashion, but it's a saturation evidence that's qualitative. But the other evidence that you're looking for in qualitative research, particularly when you're in the generative space or the problem solving space, is actually a quite different form of evidence. It tends to be what's unusual or what's surprising or what's an edge case. And that's I found this thing that we could potentially solve. And I think a lot to that, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie, a documentary, Objectified, but wonderful documentary, highly recommended. And one of the case studies they do is a case study of the oxo peeler. and how that came to be. And that's just, how do you find that moment if somebody has a need and solve for that need? And that is, and to the storytelling part of that, it's then, how do you bring the richness out, right? So that's where you can't use AI to distill that. You can't distill the richness out of it at all. It has to be like, it's the video of the story. It's the facial expression they made in the moment, or it's that kind of little thing that this is what I caught as a researcher, and this is why I thought this was interesting, and bringing that to stakeholders so that they can experience the same thing, because it's very powerful to see the actual video or see the actual moment or hear the story in context.
You got me thinking right there about what's the ratio of facts to persuasion in any quanta of evidence. And I think that'll vary, right? But my premise would be that there is no evidence that is completely absent of persuasion, and that that's a key area where the design discipline has a way to edge into these discussions.
So a lot of where I've been in my career is on the receiving end of the evidence. Folks are trying to convince me so that I can convince somebody else. And I try as much as possible to make sure that I understand, you know, just like you said, there's some things that achieve saturation, you're hearing it a lot, but then what aren't you hearing, or what is surprising to you? I tend to go for, I'm more likely to be excited about something that surprises me than something that doesn't, which isn't always fair. But I would say in terms of storytelling, I try my best to understand very well the nuances of what the company is trying to do. You know, we talk about the broader strategic initiatives, and that sounds more like a buzzword than anything else. But when you distill it down to growth or retention, and you know, what is it that the business wants to do, when you can find those moments in the evidence where what design believes is correct and what product wants to do is aligned. And when you can show alignment and tell the story of that alignment, you get a lot more buy-in a lot faster than if it sounds like you're at odds. And some examples that I'll give, digital onboarding. That's something that most firms have, and you know, the business wants it to be seamless because they want that growth. If it's a cross-sell opportunity, they want the retention for someone who's, you know, got an account that's opening a new account. They want it to be seamless. And I think that there's a lot of human elements at play there too, because folks who are opening an account, who are going through that onboarding journey, they want it to be easy too. And so when you find moments in the evidence related to onboarding that's relevant, that connects to those business objectives, being able to point those out and say, hey, we want the same thing. And we're just saying it maybe in different ways. I think that that's part of the storytelling that really gets across.
I think I could stay on this topic for a couple more hours, but I do want to just kind of tease out one thing that I kind of heard, but also didn't quite hear either, which is including other people in the process from different disciplines, right? So you mentioned evidencing the technology, but what about the notion of including people in the research process and in the research ingestion process as a mechanism? Where have you seen that work? Where have you seen that not work? What kind of barriers have you encountered in trying to engage, you know, that triangle, so to speak, of design, product, and engineering into the actual process of discovery itself?
I can fill some time while you think about that.
Yeah.
Most recently, in that case of inviting people in the process, I think it was actually critical, worked on an integrated customer insights program based primarily around site visits to their location. And in those cases, you're working with lenders. These are high risk situations. You're in the field. Maybe the deal isn't even done yet. And so working with them and earning trust and bringing them in, not only is it a great practice to have a successful outcome, but you end up getting fierce advocacy from them. And that comes back to, again, building a relationship and demonstrating trust ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a design professional's responsibility is to constructively challenge the ask that they're getting, right? And I say constructively because, again, you don't want to be obnoxious. Usually the product manager, product owner has some direction as to the question that they want answered, right? Which is sometimes a product question, is less often a user question. And so two things to that. One is, I think it's incumbent upon the design professional, particularly a design researcher or UX researcher, to work with the product professional to uncover what is it that they really want to know and what's the best way to get that answer, right? And use the discipline that they've been trained. It's an obvious thing, but too often not done, right? Often just order taking and, okay, you want to know that? You want to know how many people like this? I'm going to go find out how many people like it, right? So really exploring what is it that you really want to learn and how do we get at that together? The other part of that is kind of challenging yourself to explore kind of the mixed methods approach to what are the different ways that I could achieve kind of the same answer, what would be more powerful and compelling evidence if I don't, you can't spend 6 months researching one little thing, but if there's a need to say, how can I bring to bear a more compelling argument by doing both the qualitative and quantitative, or doing both the field and lab, or doing both the attitudinal and behavioral, like then I'm bringing something that's really compelling, and then building that into storytelling is critical as well. So I think it's that really working with the product owner to distill what it is that they're trying to understand, and to the broader organization, what does the broader organization need to understand?
I'll build on that. You talk about what does the product owner want to know? And I try to look at data in terms of what could we know? We have all this data in front of us, a wealth of knowledge, and not everyone has that at their fingertips. So when you do have that level of data, what could it show? And just let it take you in directions that you may not have thought that it would. I think back to who do you include and how do you include them early? It's really just talking to your counterparts. Maybe it's not even the folks that are executing the project at hand or the stakeholders that you need to convince. Maybe it's folks that are, orbiting the team who have done something similar and bringing them in for their perspective. I think the more perspectives that you can have, the more that people feel involved along the way, the better. And then I also, in certain circumstances, when it's relevant, try to include the folks that might say no to you very early on. So legal risk and compliance, you may say, well, where do they really fit into the fact finding, in the beginning? But when you can early on say, hey, this is what we're trying to discern. What do you think? What would you be interested in seeing? And get data points for them too. Make them feel like they're part of the process. They'll become proponents.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that, because I had that exact situation, right? How do you avoid the wall of text and the multiple click-throughs? And the way you get around that is working with these folks, speaking their language and understanding that they're coming at it from its all downside. If you do anything other than a wall of text, it's risk. So you got to speak to that incentive. How am I going to do that? I trust you. I'm going to help you achieve your mission, and I'm going to do it in a way that makes our customer come back over and over.
Yeah, and just go ahead.
What you just reminded me of a project that I worked on with the AML team, and we were under new regulations, and we had to beef up a lot of the KYC metrics that we were bringing in, and we had a really difficult time at first until we reframed it, until we brought them in and said, listen, like this is as a customer, here's the experience that you're going to have. We have to find some middle ground. Using competitive intel is something that's been really critical in roles that I've had. Hey, maybe I can't convince you based on the data that we've got in-house, but here's what other folks are doing out in the industry, and here's the best in class scenario. And when we look at CSAT or we look at metrics across the industry, here's where we're getting really, really good feedback. And so perhaps there's some way we can meet in the middle and then iterate along the way. What's the minimum viable that you would be comfortable with? Let's push that a little bit and then see where you can end up.
And maybe a nuanced point. I think the other part of this is in defining the questions and in exploring the questions, the product owner is going to have product questions, right? It's an obvious statement. But what sometimes the UX professional doesn't have enough of is user questions. And it really is the UX professional's job to ask the questions about the user and about how the user thinks and what their mental model is, not really so much about the product, right? They may be in a position to get at some of those questions because of the studies that they're running or the research that they're conducting anyway. But the mindset is, okay, I need to get at your product questions, or I may need to get at some of these compliance that I have a mechanism, I have a platform to answer some of these questions. But at the end of the day, I need to have a set of questions that really help me understand and empathize with the end user. Otherwise, I'm not a UX professional, right?
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I think there's a whole element we could stay on for eternity around teaming structures and keeping people universally focused in on something where everyone starts to absorb a little bit of each other's crafts, right? And so you're explaining the why from a experience design perspective, but you're also hearing the why from a legal risk and compliance perspective and finding ways to meet in the middle, right? So it's kind of almost we came full circle on the why side of the equation. Let's just give it up for our panelists today. Thank you, Rob, Lauren, and John. Great conversation.